Hi, my name is Emma, and I'm a 23-year-old medical student living in Chicago. I've always been someone who believed in hard work and planning for the future. Ever since high school, I've been working part-time jobs, applying for scholarships, and saving every penny I could to build my college fund. It wasn't easy, but I was proud of what I'd accomplished. By the time I started my final year of medical school, I had saved $45,000. Enough to cover my tuition and living expenses for the year. But then, everything came crashing down. It started with a phone call from my dad, David. He sounded casual, almost cheerful, as he told me, "Hey, I just wanted to let you know I had to use your college fund to take care of some things. You didn't need it anyway, right? You're smart. You'll figure something out." I froze. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad had drained my entire college fund, the money I had worked so hard to save, without even asking me. And the worst part? He didn't even seem to think it was a big deal. I tried to keep my voice calm as I asked, "How much is left?" "None of it," he said, as if it were nothing. "I had some debts to clear up, but don't worry. You'll figure something out. You always do." I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just about the money, this was about trust. My dad had always been irresponsible with money. Gambling, failed business ventures, borrowing from family members and never paying them back. But I never thought he would stoop this low. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers, but instead I just said, "I see, well, good luck with that." He laughed, mistaking my calm for acceptance. "That's my girl. Always practical, just like your old man. Anyway, I've got to run. Meeting some friends for drinks. We'll talk soon." Meeting friends for drinks. With my money. My future. I hung up the phone and sat down at my desk, staring out at the Chicago skyline. I had 3 months left until the start of my final year, and now I had no idea how I was going to pay for it. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to let him get away with this. He thought I'd just let it go. He thought I'd forgive him like I always had. But this time, he was wrong. After that phone call, I sat in silence for what felt like hours. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. My dad, the man who was supposed to support me, had stolen everything I'd worked so hard for. And the way he said it, so casual, so dismissive, made it even worse. I kept replaying his words in my head. "You didn't need it anyway, you'll figure something out." As if I had a choice. As if I hadn't spent years building that fund, sacrificing nights out with friends, working double shifts and applying for every scholarship I could find. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I shouldn't have been surprised. My dad had always been reckless with money. Growing up, I'd seen him borrow from my mom, my grandmother, even my cousins, always promising to pay it back, but never following through. When I was a kid, he used to take the money I got for birthdays or holidays, saying, "I'll hold on to this for you so you don't lose it." I never saw that money again. And then there were the gambling debts, the failed business ventures, the constant excuses. My mom, Laura, had always tried to shield me from it, but I wasn't blind. I knew my dad had a problem. I just never thought he'd go this far. The worst part? He was still listed as a co-signer on the account. I'd opened it when I was 17, and back then, I needed a parent's signature. I never thought he'd actually use that against me. I checked my phone again, hoping maybe he texted me an apology or some kind of explanation. Instead, I saw this. "Don't mention this to your mom or grandma. No need to worry them." Of course, he didn't want them to know, just like he didn't want them to know about the gambling debts or the money he'd borrowed from family members. He always had a way of spinning things to make himself look like the victim. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. The balance was exactly what I feared, $0. I scrolled through the transaction history, and there it was, withdrawal after withdrawal, all made by him. He hadn't even tried to hide it. The account had held just over $45,000, money I'd earned through scholarships, part-time jobs, and careful budgeting, and he'd drained it all in less than a month. I felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over me. This wasn't just about the money. This was about trust. My dad had always told me, family comes first. But now I realized what that really meant to him. Family was just another resource he could exploit. I thought about calling him back, demanding answers, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. He'd just brush it off, like he always did. Instead, I started making a list. First, I needed documentation, bank statements showing the account's history, proof of my deposits, records of the scholarships I'd earned. Next, I needed to figure out my options. Could I get financial aid from my university? Could I take out a loan? Could I find a part-time job that would cover my expenses? I wasn't going to let him ruin my future. I'd worked too hard to get here, and I wasn't about to let him take that away from me. He thought I was being practical when I calmly accepted his theft. But what he didn't realize was that practical was exactly what he should fear. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. I wasn't going to sit around feeling sorry for myself. If my dad thought I'd just roll over and accept what he'd done, he was about to get a rude awakening. The first thing I did was gather every piece of evidence I could find. I printed out bank statements showing the account's history, highlighting every deposit I'd made over the years, scholarships, part-time jobs, summer internships. It was all there. I also saved screenshots of the text messages he'd sent me, including the one where he admitted to draining the account. I knew I couldn't go to the police. Legally, he was still a co-signer on the account, which meant he had the right to access it, but that didn't mean I was powerless. I started researching my options. I called my university's financial aid office and explained the situation. The woman on the other end of the line was sympathetic, but there wasn't much she could do without more documentation. She suggested I apply for emergency funding and look into private loans. Loans. The thought of taking on more debt made my stomach turn. I'd worked so hard to avoid that, and now, because of my dad, I was being forced into a corner. I also started looking for part-time jobs. I'd already been working as a tutor for high school students, but it wasn't enough to cover my tuition and living expenses. I needed something more stable, something that paid better. That evening, my roommate Lila came home to find me surrounded by bank statements and my laptop. "What's going on?" she asked, setting her bag down. I hesitated for a moment, then told her everything. How my dad had drained my college fund, how he'd brushed it off like it was no big deal, how I was scrambling to figure out what to do next. Her reaction was immediate. "He did what?" she exclaimed, grabbing one of the bank statements. "Emma, this is theft. Can't you report him?" I shook my head. Legally, he had access to the account. There's nothing I can do about that. Lila sat down beside me, her face a mix of anger and disbelief. "I can't believe he would do this to you. What kind of parent steals from their own child?" I didn't have an answer for her. The next day, I called my grandmother, Helen. She'd always been my biggest supporter, the one person in my family who truly believed in me. If anyone could help me, it was her. When I told her what had happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice that was both calm and furious, she said, "He's gone too far this time." Helen promised to help me in any way she could. She even offered to cover some of my expenses, but I hesitated to accept. I didn't want to burden her, especially since she was already retired and living on a fixed income. Instead, I asked for her advice. She suggested I start by confronting him directly, but I wasn't ready for that yet. I needed more time to prepare. Meanwhile, the texts from my dad kept coming. "Don't stress about the money. You worry too much. Maybe this is a sign you should take a break from school. I know some guys who could get you a modeling job, better money than that degree." Each message made my blood boil. It was clear he didn't value my education or my independence. To him, I was just another resource to exploit, another safety net for his bad decisions. But I wasn't going to let him win. I added another item to my growing to-do list: close any remaining accounts he might know about. I transferred what little money I had left to a new bank and made sure he couldn't access it. That evening, I received an email from my grandmother. She'd called my dad earlier that day, and apparently he'd been nervous when she brought up my college fund. "Is everything okay?" she asked in the email. I smiled for the first time in days. My dad had always been afraid of my grandmother. She was the only person who had ever successfully held him accountable. I wrote back, "Can we talk? There's something you should know." The family meeting was set for the following weekend. My grandmother Helen had called everyone together, my mom, Laura, my Aunt Rachel, and a few other close relatives. My dad, David, wasn't invited. I was nervous as I logged into the video call. I'd never been one to air family drama, but this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about holding my dad accountable for what he'd done, not just to me, but to everyone he'd taken advantage of over the years. When the call started, my grandmother didn't waste any time. "Emma has something to share," she said, her voice firm. "And I think it's time we all hear the truth." I took a deep breath and began. I explained how I'd saved for years to build my college fund, how my dad had drained it without my knowledge, and how he'd brushed it off like it was no big deal. I shared the bank statements, the text messages, and the emails. As I spoke, I watched the reactions on their faces. My mom's hands trembled as she read through the screenshots. My Aunt Rachel's jaw tightened with anger. "I had no idea," my mom whispered. "He told me you decided to take a break from school, that you were thinking about moving back home." Of course he had. My dad had always been good at spinning stories to suit his needs. My Aunt Rachel, who's a lawyer, leaned forward. "Legally, this is tricky," she said. "Since he was a co-signer on the account, he technically had the right to access it. But there might be other angles we can pursue. Has he made any promises in writing about repaying the money?" I pulled up more screenshots. Emails where he'd acknowledged the money was for my education. Texts where he'd casually mentioned paying me back someday. "Perfect," Rachel said. "It's not legally binding, but it's excellent leverage for what comes next." "What comes next?" my mom asked, her voice shaky. "Next," my grandmother said, her tone sharp. "We make David realize exactly what he's done, and whom he's done it to." The plan came together quickly. My grandmother would confront him first, letting him know the family was aware of his actions. My Aunt Rachel would draft a formal demand letter, laying out his options for making restitution. And my mom, after years of hesitation, decided it was finally time to file for divorce. "Oh, treated, he's always underestimated you," my grandmother said to me after the meeting. "Treated you like an extension of himself instead of your own person. It's time to show him who you really are." The next day, my dad called me. His voice was careful, almost nervous. "Your grandmother seemed upset today," he said. "You didn't tell her anything, did you?" "About what, Dad?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "The college fund you stole, the future you tried to derail, or just your general belief that my education means nothing compared to your bar tab?" There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, finally, he said, "Now, Princess, don't be like that." "Don't call me Princess," I snapped. "And don't call me at all. Everything goes through Aunt Rachel from now on." "Rachel? Why would your aunt need to be involved?" "Because she's a lawyer, Dad, and you're about to need one too." I hung up before he could respond. The next few days were a whirlwind. My grandmother called him first, as planned, and from what she told me, the conversation didn't go well. "How dare you," she'd said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Stealing your daughter's college fund? Have you no shame?" "Mother, please." He'd tried to lower his voice. "This is a family matter." "Exactly," she'd replied. "And you've betrayed your family. Now leave before I call the police." He left, but the texts kept coming. "Your grandmother's turned you against me? I'm your father. You owe me respect. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" I forwarded each message to my Aunt Rachel without responding. Let him dig his hole deeper. The demand letter arrived at his house a few days later, sent via certified mail. Inside was a detailed accounting of every penny he'd taken, along with options for repayment. "You can't sue your own father," he called, outraged. "Watch me," I replied, then hung up. The family fallout was spectacular. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years called to express their disgust. His sister, my Aunt Patricia, shared stories of how he'd borrowed money from her kids' birthday cards. "He's always been like this," she said, taking what isn't his, expecting everyone to forgive him because he's family. My mom, meanwhile, filed for divorce, citing financial infidelity among other reasons. During their first hearing, his pattern of stealing from me came to light. "You emptied your daughter's college fund to pay gambling debts?" the judge asked incredulously. "I was going to pay it back," he protested weakly. "Well, what money?" the judge shot back. "According to these statements, you haven't held a steady job in 3 years." His carefully constructed image of the fun-loving, generous father was crumbling. And I wasn't done yet. The fallout from my dad's actions was swift and brutal. For years, he had managed to skate by on charm and excuses, but this time, there was no escaping the consequences. The demand letter my Aunt Rachel had sent was the first domino to fall. It laid out everything in black and white: the $45,000 he had taken, the proof of his withdrawals, and the text messages where he admitted to using the money. It also gave him 2 options: repay the full amount within 6 months or face legal action. At first, he tried to ignore it. He didn't respond to the letter, and when my grandmother called to follow up, he brushed her off. "It's not a big deal," he said. "Emma's overreacting. She'll get over it." But I wasn't going to get over it. With Rachel's help, I filed a formal complaint with the family court, citing financial abuse and requesting mediation. My dad was served with the paperwork a week later, and from what I heard, he was furious. "How could you do this to me?" he yelled over the phone when he called me. "I'm your father." "You stopped being my father the moment you stole from me," I replied calmly. "This isn't about you anymore. It's about what's right." The mediation process was tense. My dad showed up looking disheveled and defensive, clearly unprepared for what was about to happen. Rachel, on the other hand, was calm and professional, laying out the facts with precision. "Mr. Carter," the mediator said, addressing my dad, "it's clear from the evidence that you withdrew these funds without your daughter's consent. While you may have had legal access to the account, your actions constitute a breach of trust and financial harm." "I was going to pay it back," my dad protested. "I just needed some time." "Do you have a repayment plan in place?" Rachel asked, her tone sharp. He stammered, unable to come up with an answer. The mediator gave him a deadline. He had 30 days to provide a detailed repayment plan or face further legal action. My dad left the meeting looking defeated, but I wasn't holding my breath. I knew him too well to believe he'd suddenly change. Meanwhile, the rest of the family was rallying around me. My grandmother, Helen, had taken it upon herself to call every relative and let them know what had happened. The stories that came out were shocking. "He borrowed $5,000 from me last year," my cousin Sarah said. "Said it was for a business investment. I never saw a dime of it." "He took money from my kids' college fund," my Aunt Patricia added. "Promised to pay it back, but of course he didn't. It was like a dam had broken. For years, my dad had been taking advantage of everyone around him, and now, finally, people were speaking out." My mom, Laura, was hit the hardest. She had always tried to see the best in my dad, even when he didn't deserve it. But this time, she couldn't ignore the truth. "I feel like I've been living with a stranger," she said one night as we talked on the phone. "How could I have been so blind?" "It's not your fault, Mom," I told her. "He's been manipulating all of us for years, but now we're finally seeing him for who he really is." The divorce proceedings moved quickly. My mom's lawyer was relentless, using my dad's financial irresponsibility as evidence of his unfitness as a partner. By the end of it, my mom was awarded the house, her savings, and full custody of my younger brother, Ethan. As for my dad, he was left with nothing but his debts and his excuses. The final blow came when my grandmother decided to cut him off completely. For years, she had been his safety net, bailing him out whenever he got into trouble. But after what he did to me, she'd had enough. "I'm done enabling him," she said. "He needs to learn that actions have consequences." Without her support, my dad's life quickly spiraled out of control. He lost his apartment, his car, and most of his friends. The family had turned their backs on him, and for the first time in his life, he was truly alone. I wish I could say I felt sorry for him, but I didn't. He had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. As for me, things were finally starting to look up. With my family's support, I was able to secure a private loan to cover my tuition. My grandmother helped me with my living expenses, and I picked up extra shifts at work to make ends meet. It wasn't easy, but I was determined to move forward. One day, as I was walking to class, I got a text from my dad. "I'm sorry for everything. I know I messed up. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. After everything that had happened, I realized that moving forward wasn't just about rebuilding my finances. It was about rebuilding myself. My dad's betrayal had shaken me to my core, but it had also taught me some hard truths about trust, resilience, and the importance of standing up for myself. The first step was focusing on my education. With the private loan secured and my grandmother's help, I was able to stay in school. I threw myself into my studies, determined to make the most of the opportunity I had fought so hard to keep. But it wasn't just about academics. I started working more hours at my tutoring job, and eventually I picked up a second job as a barista at a local coffee shop. The long hours were exhausting, but they gave me a sense of control over my life that I hadn't felt in a long time. My mom, Laura, was also starting to rebuild her life. The divorce had been finalized, and she and my younger brother, Ethan, had moved into a smaller but cozy apartment. For the first time in years, she seemed lighter, freer. "I didn't realize how much of myself I'd lost," she told me one evening as we sat in her new living room. "But now, I feel like I can finally breathe again." Ethan, who was only 12, was adjusting too. He didn't fully understand what had happened with our dad, but he knew enough to feel hurt and confused. I made it a point to spend more time with him, taking him to the park or helping him with his homework. "You're the best big sister," he said one night as we played a board game. Hearing that made all the stress and exhaustion worth it. As for my dad, David, he continued to spiral. He never followed through on the repayment plan, and Rachel eventually filed a civil suit against him on my behalf. The court ruled in my favor, but collecting the money was another story. He had nothing left to give. I thought about him sometimes, wondering if he regretted what he'd done. But I'd never reached out. I had made my peace with the fact that he wasn't the father I needed him to be, and I wasn't going to waste any more energy trying to fix a relationship that had been broken for years. Instead, I focused on the relationships that mattered. My grandmother, Helen, became my rock during this time. She was always there with a kind word or a piece of advice, reminding me that I was stronger than I realized. "You've been through hell," she said one afternoon as we sat on her porch sipping tea. "But look at you now. You're still standing. That's what matters." Her words stuck with me. Over time, I started to feel like myself again. I joined a few campus organizations, made new friends, and even started dating someone, a kind, thoughtful guy named Alex who treated me with the respect and care I hadn't realized I deserved. One day, as I was cleaning out my old files, I came across the bank statements and text messages from my dad. For a moment, I felt a pang of anger and sadness, but it quickly passed. I didn't need those reminders anymore. I shredded the papers and deleted the screenshots from my phone. It was time to let go of the past and focus on the future. Graduation day came faster than I expected. As I walked across the stage to accept my diploma, I felt a surge of pride and relief. I had done it. Despite everything my dad had tried to take from me, I had made it. After the ceremony, my family gathered to celebrate. My mom, Ethan, my grandmother, and even my Aunt Rachel were there, cheering me on. "I'm so proud of you," my mom said, tears in her eyes. "Your dad didn't break you," my grandmother added. "He tried, but he failed. You're stronger than he'll ever be." That night, as I sat in my tiny apartment, surrounded by cards and flowers from friends and family, I thought about how far I'd come. My dad's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been a turning point. It forced me to grow up, to take control of my life, and to realize that I was capable of so much more than I'd ever imagined. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I was ready for it.